we're living in this nanny society where you can be raised on YouTube or Disney Plus or whatever it is, and just sit your kids in front of it all day and then just go live your life and think that you're parenting. And hey, sure, as long as you're feeding them and they're growing, that's one thing, but they're going to find that meaning crisis by the end because they've never had to try to experience or learn or build themselves up in the direction that their own internal compass is pointing, because everything is just fast food. You know, it's like feeding your kid cheeseburgers their entire life. Sure, it'll get them through life at a minimum level on that Maslow's hierarchy, but you're not going to be able to go many rungs higher than that because they've never even had direction in how to amplify that. You stand at the throw switch of a trolley that will either send a speeding trolley that's coming towards you left or right. And on the left side of the track, if you don't throw the switch, 5 people are tied up and will surely die if you don't throw the switch. Whereas on the right side, there's 1 person tied up who will surely die if you do throw the switch. What do you do? And so the obvious answer is, well, I'm going to save the 5 people instead of the 1. I'm sorry, for the sake of the many, we're going to kill the few. And then it turns out that that guy would have cured cancer. You know, and you find out these things later on, that these trolley problems that seem obvious start stacking upon each other. And what started out to be an obvious struggle for autonomy turns out to be an absolute dystopian tragedy. I'm going to step both feet off and make my regrets on the way down. Mm-hmm. And that has serviced me over and over and over in life and led me into places that I would never have gone by choice. And I would never take back after that, the fact. So if I were to encourage anybody out there who is in those situations or finds himself in those situations, my unsolicited advice is jump both feet in and make your regrets on the way down.
Welcome to The Competent Man. Today, I sat down with Drew Weatherhead. It was a very captivating and wide-ranging conversation where we covered everything from his passion for Brazilian jiu-jitsu, many of the weird parallels in our lives, to finding your life's purpose, free will, and his thoughts on becoming the most effective teacher and communicator of big concepts. I hope you enjoy it. Drew Weatherhead, welcome to The Competent Man. How are you?
Very good. Thanks for having me on today, Tom.
I'm really looking forward to this. You and I met a couple weeks ago at the Cornerstone Forum held by Sean Newman. And, we were introduced by a mutual friend who, when I explained the concept of the podcast, said, you need to meet Drew right away. And boy, was he right. You and I seemed to hit it off right away. And as you kind of put it, our paths seem to be almost one bit off in the simulation. And I wanted to chat a little bit about that, about the similarity between our paths, the similarity between a lot of the way that you and I have learned a lot of the things that we are now very passionate about, or maybe have been taken over by a muse of, which we'll get into explaining a little bit more about that later. But why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your path through life and some of the similarities as you saw it through our stories?
Sure. Well, I mean, I found it fascinating that we were introduced in that way. It's not that we're introduced in that forum. There's a lot of cool people that I was happy to meet, and there's kind of like a gathering point for interesting minds in general. So I'm happy to talk to anybody. But the more you and I were chatting, we just sort of sat down, we were like, holy crap, there is like just one after another of parallel experiences, like just from the baseline of career choices all the way through lifestyle choices. I mean, we were both welders for a long time. We both live on the road now full time. There's all sorts of different things. And then there's like these strange little peculiarities that it seems like the longer we talk, the more it's like, well, that's kind of happened to me too, kind of thing. So it is curious, and I enjoy it. It's either I'm being pranked right now, or this is just a really cool serendipitous occurrence. But I mean, like, I could go 100 different directions about where to start in my life, where I've gotten to now, what type of things to focus on. But that's kind of the fun of my own experience, and I'm sure yours as well, is at any given point, I couldn't have really charted the next year out in my life. And that maybe that comes off as bidding anxiety to some people, but it's kind of been normalized up to this point where I kind of feel like a little bit of a leaf in the wind, but you kind of get used to surfing it.
Mm-hmm. one of the interesting parallels that I found was, you know, the fact that we were both welders for many years. Um, I was a pipe welder. You I believe you were a structural welder, right?
Yeah, I did shop. Yeah, I didn't want to go out to the oil field. I had a family and kids I didn't want to, disappear from.
Hmm. And the detail of both being welders is pretty um, monotonous to me.
Sure.
But the fact that you and I both ended up kind of taking this idea of putting our earbuds in for literal years at a time and receiving an education on anything and everything. And the oddity to me was that we were both doing this at about the same time. You know, we kind of shared this idea of when we were when we were trying to learn all of these different things, when our again around the same time when we were really had this idea that I can be learning or at very least entertained while I'm working by putting my earbuds in and crushing podcast after podcast or audiobooks. I've said many times there wasn't enough material back then for me to be able to actually listen to and get through a day. And I just listened to anything and everything from Sam Harris, as you and I said, was a similarity to Joe Rogan, the nature of consciousness, so many of these things. How do you feel like that that curiosity or that channel of learning through audio was super critical in your development to where you are now?
Oh, it 100% was. I make the distinction between education in a more typical traditional manner to what people get through podcasts is kind of like a choose your own adventure.
Mhm.
Whereas in school, sure, you can choose your majors and such, but once you sit down in the classroom, it's kind of, whatever the teacher wants. Whereas whether you're picking through podcasts that have specific ideas that they touch on, or if you're literally just picking up books on Audible that have very specific topics and literally giving yourself a high level overview of very complicated but nuanced topics to sort of round out things that you want to learn about. That's the thing that really blew my mind. Like the one that cracked the nut for me, really. Joe Rogan was great when it came to every day, every 5 days a week, you'd have 3 hours plus of conversation with somebody interesting,
Mhm.
whether it was a comedian or a scientist or, mathematician or fill in the blank, doctors, etc. He brought on everybody because he is curious. And his curiosity allowed for us to be that fly on the wall and listen to all sorts of things that I found curious in a way that I wasn't introduced to them before I was. And once the introduction was made, it was like, for example, a good one is Dan Carlin. So Dan Carlin is a history podcaster for people who don't know. He's not quite as popular anymore, but back in the day, he would put out tens of hours of content every few months on a particular topic, whether it was World War I, World War II, the Mongols, fill in the blank. Like he went through all of major historical instances. And I remember before being turned on or discovering Dan Carlin, being absolutely bored to tears about history. I couldn't care less. I didn't care about the History Channel. I didn't care about history class. I thought it was all very boring. I was raised in Canada where history consisted of like the beaver pelt trade on the St. Lawrence River. And like I could care less. But listening to this guy go into the intricacies of different points of view, the Russian point of view, the German point of view, the American point of view, the Japanese point of view, through all of these major historical events, and then leading his series on the dropping of the bombs, the creation of the bombs, the Cold War after that. It just had me on the edge of my proverbial seat. Well, again, I was welding monotonously for 10 to 12 hours a day, but just like how else would I, while working a full-time job and maintaining the income for a family, be able to get 12 hours a day of education a la carte, how you would like to, while you're doing your job? I mean, I didn't feel like I was being any less productive at work, but at the same time, you have this sort of auto feed going on in the side of your ears to the back of your brain that just it's edifying in a very strange way. And as all of those information streams sort of culminated into the river of ideas that then populated your brain, man, you're carried away to very interesting places that, I couldn't recommend highly enough to people out there that want to do their own research, as they say.
And we've now realized what a threat that is. But as you're talking about the idea of being more or less productive at work, I almost found that it made me more productive because I just wanted to get back on the floor and keep going with the podcast or audiobook or whatever it was that I was learning about, because I was so engrossed in getting to the end of that and then having a little bit of time to be able to think about that and consider it and really digest that new area of information that, just as you said, that I hadn't really been exposed to before. And it's so interesting to me having that particular conversation with another guest of my other podcast, Palisades Gold Radio. He writes a lot about the difference between lateral versus linear thinkers. And when I explained to him what I was doing, how I got my education in this, and welding at the same time, he was blown away by that idea. I don't think that this way of learning really works for anyone or for everyone, right? The idea of being able to intake information while actively being focused on another task, I don't know if it works for everyone.
That's a really good question. I've never really thought about that. It almost seems like it's a form of hypnosis in a strange way, because although it's in your front of consciousness, it's also at the same time sort of in your subconscious, because you're sort of automating your task the same way that you would. I find I get the most out of audiobooks when I'm not welding anymore, when I'm driving, because I'm doing a task that is sort of an autonomous task that my body and my peripheral and my, parts of the brain that are involved in just like routine actions is occupied, so that then this, for whatever reason, maybe it's my ADD or whatever, it seems to saturate a little bit easier, and I can pick up and I get more interested in things as long as I keep myself busy while I'm doing them. And again, I don't know if that's an everybody thing, if that's a particular brain type thing, but it's certainly worked for me, as it sounds like it's worked for you.
Mm-hmm. Well, and this is something that you and I didn't really cover, is this idea of understanding how our brains work. The idea of being whatever particular brand of ADD, which I think is, very overdiagnosed and over handicapped for maybe in this
Definitely.
age. But for myself, I know understanding a bit more about how my brain works, being able to keep it busy and fed with interesting ideas and interesting information is very, very critical to me. I mean, I've explored all kinds of different realms, different ideas, and it certainly sounds, that way for you. So, I guess to kind of round out a little bit more about where our paths are very similar and where they diverge, welding was obviously one of those similarities. I took up dirt biking, where you ended up being a black belt in jujitsu. We're both podcasters, and you're now an author. So one of the ideas that I heard you kind of talk about before is this idea of being a structured pantser. So tell me a little bit more about that idea and how that serves you in your writing.
Sure. So I'll give a little bit of background to that terminology, because it's very niche within the writer authorship community. People tend to, it's joking, right? It's kind of a colloquial, tongue-in-cheek saying that, or asking somebody if they're a pantser or a plotter, or somebody who builds out a structure for what they're going to write, or somebody who just sits down at the keyboard and just, again, flies with the wind. And for myself, I was not classically trained as in the literary arts. I've got a decent command of the English language, but most of that was brought on honestly. I couldn't really show you where to conjugate a verb in the average sentence, but I could write a compelling story. And so to come to your point about the difference between the pantser and the plotter is, again, you've got one that plots it out and lays out a structure, whereas the other one typically just runs by the seat of their pants. And both work to a degree, but I found that before I even came across these terms, I kind of knew how I liked to build out ideas for myself, because I've been doing this firstly in podcasting and secondly in jujitsu for a long time. is when I have an idea, I need to write it down in point form. This is what works for me. And I mean, I'm not giving general advice, but I'll just tell you what works for me because it really works for me. When I do this, it works every time.
Mhm.
Is I will take my idea, I'll write down the major points that need to be hit, that this is the important parts, like the think of it like the skeletal structure of a body. You're not going to function without a spine. You're not going to function without a hip, without a skull. These things need to be plotted out first. And then after that, once I know what needs to be done, I can start filling out in between in a much more serendipitous sense where it just, whatever comes to you, comes to you. And for myself in the writing of my books, I've written 3 books now. And my third one is actually the first in a 4-book series that I'm going into the fantasy or fictional world, whereas my first 2 were philosophical treatise. So it's much more, nonfiction and speaking about life and different philosophical ideas. But it works for everything. It works for fiction. It works for nonfiction. And again, I use this in jujitsu too, because I do instructional videos where I'll be like, okay, this instructional video is going to be this many videos or this many clips about a particular idea in jujitsu, whether it is guard work or whether it's a certain type of strangle or a certain type of joint lock. All right, these are the things that I need to hit. And then I start filling in the meat after that. And I can put it together really quickly, and it blends the beauty of both of those worlds together for me.
Yeah, I was going to ask how that structure brings itself into jujitsu because, as a layman in jujitsu and basically most martial arts, I look at that and I look at maybe doing a drill and think there's only so many parts to it. So it's more so creating content around that, right? Is what you're explaining?
Yeah, in a sense, yes. So jujitsu, as opposed to most martial arts, I won't say all, but most martial arts, is incredibly expansive. And what it is it's basically like 4D chess played at speed against someone trying to do the same thing against you. Whereas a lot of other martial arts, for people who don't know what jujitsu is when it comes to martial arts, is it's all grappling. It's joint locks, submissions, chokes, and positional pinning, takedowns, etc. So it's everything you see in wrestling on top of everything you see in judo on top of everything that you see in mixed martial arts when it hits the ground, except for striking. We leave the striking out and you kind of fill in those blanks with another martial art, generally speaking. But when it comes to other martial arts, they're typically hyper focused on striking because I mean we're a bipedal creature who tends to have the freedom of their arms to use for their primary weapons. So you need to learn how to defend yourself and strike back when it comes to those sorts of things. But when you learn those patterns, what it becomes, whether it's boxing or karate or Muay Thai, fill in the blank, is it comes down to more muscle memory. Once you learn your footwork, once you learn your head positioning, once you learn how to duck, slip, throw jabs and hooks, then it's more just getting the time in, putting the mat time in and chunking this thing so it becomes more and more natural so you don't have to think about it and you go on autopilot faster and faster and then you're going to be able to, really become skilled. Whereas jujitsu, it's less of that. It's maybe 20% of what we do in a sparring match is on autopilot. I mean, you could throw percentages around, but a lot of it is like, well, I can't tell you what my opponent's going to do 3 moves from now. I'm going to have to find out. And when he does, I better have an answer for it or else he's going to get 2 moves ahead of me. So this is what I mean by kind of speed chess. Like there's rules to the game, but it's more like anatomical rules. Like you can prevent somebody from being able to move in a certain position that then gives you an avenue to move past them or onto them or through them in a way that is very difficult to defend against if you don't know the proper counters. So it's a constant accumulation of more and more techniques. And then you'll eventually sort of figure out the mean for what works for your body, for your particular personality type, and then you'll get to a black belt somewhere down the path on that route.
Mm-hmm. I started reading through your book called Consciousness, Reality, and Purpose, and the idea that you bring up in the book is being taken over by a muse, and I think this actually really applies to many of the, let's say, topics that I wanted to cover with you today. And many of the avenues that we both share and that are both different. So something that I have explored with previous guests on this show in the past is this idea of passion and how passion led these previous guests to the outcomes or the interests that they had. And you've tied this together in the book very interestingly. And in thinking about this conversation today and thinking about these different avenues, it really seems to me that it's a very interesting way of explaining the idea of passion in a more abstract sense. So how do you think about the muse in your life?
Yeah, I love this topic. So, for people who don't know what we're talking about, the muse, historically speaking, was a form of demigod in Grecian. I was going to say religion, but it's like a pantheon, right? They have a whole bunch of different gods, but it's mostly myth and legend and lore. But people took it very seriously back in the day, and I think that most of the things that serve or survive the test of time has a kernel of truth in it somewhere. Now, I don't personally literally pray to the muses, but I do believe there is something to the ethereal nature of consciousness when it comes to the life that we live, and something about the interconnectivity of conscious beings. And they used to call this the ether back in the day. And you only have to go back maybe 120, 150 years into the 1800s, and you'll find them using that as a very recognizable term. In the ether, it's in the ether. You hear that sometimes as a colloquial term now. But what they're talking about, or what they're alluding to, is this idea of an ethereal realm that exists outside of the material but intersects with it somehow. Descartes had a way of describing this, which came into what we would describe right now as Cartesian dualism, is the idea of the difference between mind and body, or the interconnectivity between mind and body, in that they are vitally important to be able to exist in the way that we do, but they're not actually the same thing. And I think whatever the muse or the muses are probably exists somewhere on that ethereal plane. Like, my favorite analogy for Cartesian dualism is the difference between a radio and a signal. Because the radio is what you see. It's the physical thing. You can look at it, you can touch it, you can dissect it, you can find the little cogs and gears and figure out how everything works, but nothing will come out of that. It serves no function unless you have a signal that it gets transmitted and translated through into audible sound.
Mhm.
But people can look at that and say, well, the radio is the signal, and they can be forgiven for thinking that, because all they ever see is the noise coming out of the radio. They can't see the signal. And I think that that is a very acute representation of what dualism is trying to explain, and what a lot of religions, I think, have come across in their own kernels of truth and own experience, because it's all the same human experience that people are trying to put these clumsy words behind to try to describe.
Mhm.
And however that plays out with the muses, so going back to ancient Greece, people would literally pray to and sacrifice to the muses. I think there were 7 of them, and they were thought to come down and bless mankind, one person at a time, with great thoughts of scientific relevance, of musical relevance. In fact, even the word music is rooted in the word muse. The word museum is rooted in the word muse. If you wanted to go somewhere to see a collection of things that the muses blessed us with, you'd go to a museum. And even just the idea of musing, what is it to muse? It's to think about, it's to sit down and pause and ponder. You were thought to allow for it through a meditative practice, the muses to come down and touch you with this aha epiphany moment. And again, I don't know if it's worth trying to nail this down into like, this is how to contact the muse, and if you do this, then that. I think it's more of just an acceptance or allowance, or a deference to that sort of interaction. I don't even know how to put it into words, but I swear to God, like, when it hits, you just have to go with it. And that's the pantser side of me when it comes to writing. Like, I'll have a direction that I'm going, but once I start going, I'll get whipped in a different direction. I'll be like, all right, this is the direction now. And I don't think that that's whimsy. I think that that's like being guided by something and someone. And it comes up all the time in the weirdest ways. I'm telling you, Tom, like, I'll come into contact with people that I've never met before, that will have very, very similar ideas, stories, experiences, that I'm like, I don't know if I'm thinking my own thoughts anymore, because it seems like everybody, or a certain number of people, are thinking them at the same time. It's almost like the muse is scattershotting a bunch of different people and be like, do something with it. This is the great idea. Do something with it. And everybody's who's creative or artistic in some way is trying to express that into reality as their radio for this signal that everybody's kind of casting into.
it's such an interesting way of conceptualizing what what leads us, what gives us passion here. And something I've been trying to consider a lot lately is this idea that allowing space or quiet, especially, to be able to, let's say, receive those type of signals, receive maybe I don't know that I feel that receiving that type of signal is the right word for myself, but allowing the space and quiet time to be able to allow those thoughts the opportunity to present themselves is something I'm trying to be more deliberate about. This idea of the muses and this particular way that you presented the idea is something that I've literally read in the last couple of days. So it's something I need to think more about. But you know, for for those of us that basically for most people, we have the ability to never be bored. And that's something that I think we need to actually get back to in order to make space to be a better radio, maybe.
Mm. Yeah, that's a really good way of thinking about that. And if you will sort of take that idea and compare it to people groups throughout history where they didn't have radios, they didn't have books, they didn't certainly didn't have internet or cell phones in their pockets. What you'll notice is in every single people group and religion, you're going to find a meditative practice that is some sort of backbone to it. You can look at the Native Americans; they have peyote rituals, or you can look over in Japan, and they've got these long walks that they go across the entire islands where they have like Zen Buddhist beads that they count along their trail, and you can go into Judaism where people go off into the desert and fast and pray for a certain amount of time. And, it almost is less important what the ritual is and more important about what is the similarity between them all, which is again, that quietness. And I've found every single time that I can get alone with my thoughts, it is a transformative experience. Now, whether it transforms my life or not, it definitely is exciting in a way that you don't really know what's going to happen, but you should feel grateful after the fact. And I think that that's what people are kind of chasing.
Yeah, and I think a really good example of this, Drew, especially from you, is when you started podcasting. You had so many of these different ideas on the show that you felt compelled to have to write a book to kind of square all of these different ideas, thoughts, and opinions that you have every day on the show, and then be able to kind of digest all of it and pick a direction as it kind of seems like you were very, as I said, very compelled to do, right?
Definitely. So part of my upbringing, I was raised up in a very strong Christian home, and my path as far as life is concerned and the guardrails around which way you can go and how far were laid out before I could even talk in full sentences. So it wasn't until I was maybe in my early 30s and about that time where I was welding and listening to podcasts nonstop and listening to atheists and their ideas and Hindus and their ideas and a bunch of different people outside of the worldview that I was on track with opened up different trajectories of thought that then there's internal logic to everything. Like nothing exists because it's completely nonsensical. But once you'll find that you've delved into enough of these internally logistic systems, you'll have to start coming to compare them against each other and trying to find what is valuable, what is maybe nonsensical, or what is derivative to that particular worldview. And by doing so, you're going to come into contact with what a lot of the Stoics talked about, what a lot of the classic philosophers talked about, is this idea of wisdom, right? There's so much. I mean, in the world we live in now, we are inundated with information to the degree that we're trying to drink through a fire hose. There's no way to take it all in any given day. And if you keep trying to do that, you'll just go insane because most of it is either noise or it's trash or it's ill-informed or it's something that is just not useful for you for the time. And if you just keep taking it in, you're going to become more and more confused and sort of spinning your boat in the middle of the ocean trying to figure out where you're going. And what I found once I was I wouldn't say I was doing that exactly because I kind of had a path during, especially during COVID, because that's when I started my podcast in 2022. I was talking to a lot of people that were very freedom minded, that were very counterculture, that were very, what would you call it, heterodox to the norm. And they came from all sorts of different parts of life and all sorts of different paths. And so what I found is that having had hundreds of conversations with different people like this, their thoughts started taking up residency in my mind in a way that I had to sort of discern what was the mean between them, because they weren't, they would counteract each other, or they would be it'd be the antithesis one to the next, trying to figure out like, what is real, because this guy says this and this guy says that, they both sound like they're pretty logical. What do I make of this? But I think that the process of having to deal with that was more valuable than the actual discrete information that I resolved in by the end, because what you're doing is you're flexing a muscle. It's the muscle of intuition. It's the muscle of discernment, which is really, I think, the razor to the weapon of wisdom. You cannot get wisdom third person. It has to be a first person experience. And it's a one player game where you have to engage in the battle of ideas with yourself, because you can engage with the battle of ideas with as many people as you want, and you can put up as many walls, and you can self-justify as much as you want. But at the end of the day, you're going to have something going on in the back of your head being like, was I actually right? Maybe I should think about this a little bit. And maybe, you'll take that time and have to flex that muscle and compare, like, okay, this versus that. What do I actually think about this when I don't have my ego on the line in a conversation kind of thing? And I feel now like I've got a fairly attuned radar for the tool of discernment to lead towards the weapon of wisdom. And it's an ongoing thing, like it is for anybody out there. But if you aren't trying to do it, you aren't even doing it. You have to actually actively mean to purposefully discern between ideas. And so again, part of that is taking in the idea, but then the part that's really important is, what am I going to do with it? Can I do something with it? And if not, cut it off.
Mhm. Well, I mean, the idea of being able to focus and really understanding what is worth your time versus what is a rabbit hole that is meant to be just a distraction was actually the subject of my speech during the Cornerstone event.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, something that I think really weaves in and out of this conversation is this idea that we are just a collection of experiences, and in some ways a math problem, that if you had the exact same upbringing, the exact same influences that let's say I had through my upbringing, that very likely we would end up at the same types of conclusions. So this kind of brings in this idea of free will, and I think an interesting way to kind of approach this subject or this topic is through the lens of the conversation that you had with Caitlin Ford about the rise of totalitarianism, and the analogy of the cordyceps fungus and how that ends up affecting ants, right?
Yeah, man, that was a great conversation. That was a couple years back now, but anytime I can talk to Caitlin Ford, this is a fantastic conversation. She has got such a wealth of knowledge and insight. And I mean, talk about somebody who's well read. I've never met somebody so well read. Yeah, I mean, her whole focus is on learning from the mistakes of the past when it comes to totalitarianism in almost like a psychological and philosophical level. Whereas, why do people believe the things they believe that lead to the things that they do that are obviously atrocities after the fact, but seem perfectly natural and in fact normal while it's happening? Like, there's books and books that are written about, I mean, going back into the idea of learning from history about what were people doing in Germany while all of these things were happening to the Jews. Like, what were they thinking about it? It turns out that a lot of people either didn't know or didn't care or thought that it was the right thing to do because it made perfect sense in the system that they're in, all the way up to and including justifying genocide. And you see that even now. Like, there are people that will justify whatever type of killing of whatever type of people of whatever type of numbers as long as it suits their ideology. And it's terrifying. And if you don't understand that these things are sort of monsters in and of themselves, that there are some ideologies out there that will eat your soul alive. and spit out the bones and carry on to the next person. Those are things that you need to be wary of. You need to understand and give proper respect to the dangers that they impose, but also understand how to see them coming. And again, using that scalpel of discernment to recognize, like, okay, I see where this is going. This is actually not what it says it is on its face, is a wolf in sheep's clothing, and I need to steer from that. Kaylin is a fantastic resource when it comes to that, because she's gone deep into the history of China, certainly in the last 100 years, as they've been the longest, second longest running experiment with communism, right? Of collectivism, really. There's different flavors of communism around the world, but they have a very horrifying, storied experience of what happens when people get too much power on a linear top-down system.
So, Drew, where do you end up falling on this idea of free will? There's different ways to look at it. You and I have been exposed to many different ideas about it. So, as you took the time to really think about that idea, where does that scalpel of discernment bring you on that topic?
Yeah, and I will say, like, this is one that you really need to rely on that sort of radar in the dark, because if you go down the logical path of reductionist determinism, and as it pertains to free will and every molecule in the universe, like, this is old thinking back to the early 1800s. Trying to remember the guy, Duplass. I think it was Duplass's demon, where he talked about, if there was an entity, and we'll call it a demon, if there was a demon that understood and knew every molecule in the universe and the amount of energy and the direction of force that it was moving, it would be able to determine every action within the universe for all time. Mm-hmm. And then you're left with this uncomfortable feeling of, like, well, I'm molecules in the universe. Can you just, like, am I derivative? Is there anything that I can actually impose as a sovereign individual, or is this just a play that I'm a cog within, that I have to serve whatever purpose I don't even really understand or can't even understand? Or is understanding even a thing, or is this just a function of the derivative model? And it becomes a black pill, to be honest. Like, Sam Harris was the first one, and he still champions this, which makes sense as an atheist who has no interest in anything outside of the material existence of reality. It makes absolute perfect internal logical sense to that system. If those are the guidelines and the parameters that you're allowed to believe that existence exists within, then yes, we have no free will, and it's laughable that people think they do. Now, I fall on I don't know what to call it. It's not an ideology. It's more of like a intuition. And maybe intuition is exactly what allows me to feel this way, is that, you can say that I don't have free will, but does it ever feel like that? What is it about that feeling of free will? Is that just like a ghost in the machine, or is there something more going on? And in the second book that I wrote, which is called Layers of Truth, I broke down the three major focuses in that to what I've built, sort of this construct for myself, just mostly to add that backbone between the meat of what I discover afterwards. I need a construct. I need to know, like, something that makes logical sense, and then I can start exploring from there. And for me, I decided that, in my opinion, to have a well-balanced worldview, because you're never going to know everything, and nobody can be right about all things, and you're going to have to balance out some median in between there. And to have a well-balanced worldview, no matter who you are, where you are, what language you speak, what religion you came up in, et cetera, I believe that you need to have three pillars. The first pillar is the scientific. You need to have a pillar of scientific. Second is the philosophic. You need to have a pillar of the philosophic. And the third is the theologic, and you can call that spiritual or whatever. But you need to have something of a structure in all three of those things. Otherwise, if you think of housing a tabletop on top of three pillars, if you take a pillar away, it starts getting tippy. But if you have a pillar that's larger than the others, it starts getting tippy too. And this is what I mean by the balance. You need to actually build out all three, because if you get hyper-focused on one, you're going to find that you're building a monolith instead of a triune. And that becomes very susceptible to pressures that are outside of its purview. whether it's philosophic, scientific, or theologic. You can see excesses and abscesses of each when you do that. And I feel like people like Sam Harris and the pure atheistic derivative reductionists out there have a monolith of science. And they sort of sprinkle in a little bit of philosophy as it works for their science, but never, deviate from the mean of what the numbers say on math. And like, to me, that's trying to sketch out the Mona Lisa in pencil. Like where's the color? Where is the emotion? Is emotion also derivative? Is this just a bunch of hormones that are interacting, or is there something to the experience of that goes beyond? And we're just talking about the cogs. We're just talking about the radio. We're not even giving any idea to the signal or whatever exists outside of that interplays. And for myself, I believe there is free will. And I believe that because I experience it every single day at all times during the day. And for you to tell me that it doesn't exist just runs fully counter to that. And so I look at that as with the scalpel of discernment and say, sorry, that's not my experience. Experience is my experience. And that to me is it's full of free will. It's wrought with it. It's guided by it. And, action equals reaction aside, who started that action for why? Like, there's something to that I think is more than derivative.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting that you bring up this idea of being able to sketch a worldview based upon these three different layers or pillars, as you put them. A previous guest of the show, Faisal Huda, explains it another way, and this kind of ties in that idea of the muse just having a scattershot in a lot of ways, because he looks at it as different layers of onion skin. For him and I, we look at things through the economic lens, the geopolitical lens. He very much includes the theocratic lens and the scientific lens. There's all of these different layers of basically tracing paper, and unless and until you have every single one layered up, you don't have a complete picture of what you're looking at. And it's interesting that those two ideas really kind of get brought back together here in these conversations.
Yeah, I mean, that basically describes the thesis of my second book. Like, it was called Layers of Truth, but the title to it is Navigating the Objective from the Subjective, which is unfortunately everybody's job in life. And I started with an introduction chapter that tried to lay out the idea of truth, because people think, well, it's either true or it's false about everything, right? It's binary, it's black and white. And I mean, to a degree, you can make that argument that at the level of facts, but it turns out that life goes much deeper than the level of fact. And I tried to find a word, because I'm very particular in my writing when it comes to words, because, as I talked to in that first book, I'm sure you've probably got to the point where I'm saying, I think it's in the reality portion where I'm saying words themselves are a de-resolution of thought. And the less you can de-resolve that, think about going from 1080p down to 480. You know what I mean? Like, it gets less and less obvious or clear what you're trying to say as you're choosing words to sort of press they're like little bottles of meaning you're trying to press a thought into. And if you could put it in like a de-resolved bottle, it may not actually house or elicit the thought in somebody else's mind that you're trying to transmit. And the only way we can transmit until we're psychic is through words and sounds. So I'm very particular about the words I use for that exact reason. And because that is the case, when it comes to trying to define something as important as truth, I looked all over the English language, and we got synonyms for all sorts of different things and lots of different ways of thinking about truth, but they're more like thought schools than they are discrete words. So I started looking in other languages. I looked in the Japanese, I looked in the Russian, and I ended up going into the Hebrew and found one word that actually kind of culminates the idea of truth that I wanted to present as the objective truth. That means the totality of all things that are true that creates reality. And they have a word called emet. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it's spelled Emettete, I think, emet. And what it is a culmination of three letters in their alphabet that is the first, the middle, and the last letter in their alphabet to represent this is the entirety of truth. This isn't just the truth from my perspective. This isn't just the truth as it was found in a courtroom. This is the total truth. And that's in a sense, certainly in the Judeo-Christian belief, is an aspect of God. God is the way, the truth, and the light. The truth, he is the truth, the objective truth, the emet, the totality of all things that are. And that, I think, is another thing that is a mean between all religions, is God, whatever that is, if it's, God the Father or Brahman or whatever, it is the everything. It is the all things. And to find the truth in that is a fool's errand. We'll never find that. In fact, we can't, because there's levels of reality we can't even interact with. We're trying to play around at the mathematical level with things called the quantum. You can never see them. You can never hold them. You can never actually interact at a visceral level. And those are just the things that we've found recently, like we don't even know what dark matter is, what dark energy is. We don't even know if there's other dimensions of experience that are as visceral as this, that are laminated or interact with ours, all sorts of things that could possibly, the realm of possibility is endless, but we can only figure out what we can figure out in the time that we can, and then try to plug those pieces together, which comes back to the problem. The crux of the whole thing is trying to navigate the objective from the subjective. And I think the story of that whole book, if I was to sum it down, is to have empathy for people of all different views, because we're all trying to sort of make do with what little information we have in this gigantic objective experience that we're doing. And I think the more people can come to some sort of conclusion along those means, the better off society would be, because we'd stop fighting over who's the more right about every given thing and turn into a tribal battle over things that are like, man, we're just trying our best. And, unless it actually burns your house down in me trying it, it's probably not worth your time fighting me about it.
It's so interesting that you bring up this idea of truth to me. And, it almost seems like it is this very intangible idea. And one of the ways to kind of explain this is through the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. This is a book, obviously, that I have read, and I actually suggest a lot of people, or that a lot of people should read it if they have any interest in these philosophical ideas, because the book is couched within a motorcycle trip, but it is a professor's exploration of the word quality, basically. It ends up being that the attempt to define the word quality as a throwaway statement by one of his other professors at the university that he's teaching at the time. This lady comes up to him and says, "I hope you're teaching quality this semester." And he starts thinking about that and ruminating upon it. And then he has all of his students write essays trying to define what the word quality is. And it seems like it is a particular point that very few people can actually, that few of us can actually grasp, that can actually define and put a very fine point on it. And I think, you and I have talked about before this idea of the first discussion between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson trying to define truth. This is, as trite of an example or job this might be of trying to define this word, as you said, it is very important to actually come to a complementary or a commonly accepted understanding of what truth and or quality is, because we can be talking past each other simply because we don't have the same understanding of what this term actually defines.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's missing the point of people trying to figure it out in the meantime. And at what point are you done? You know what I mean? At what point do you know the truth? Mm-hmm. It's not something that you can grasp. It's a slippery fish. And the more you think you're holding it, the more it's getting away. And again, it circles back in my mind to like, give space for people to try. You know what I mean? Like, don't hold yourself so haughty. And I'm talking to everybody out there who thinks they know the truth. Good luck. Like, I'm telling you right now, you don't. You may know things that other people don't. Probably. You should. There's so many things to know out there. But again, like, I built a hierarchy in that book. I couldn't rifle it off the top of my head. This is from Layers of Truth, that talked about like the different layers or the hierarchical structure of what truth is, starting from the bottom, and actually the lowest common denominator. If we're going to think of like letters in the alphabet being the lowest common denominator to words that build language that project thought, facts are those letters. An A is an A B is a B. It makes this sound for this reason, but that doesn't really help you speak the language.
Yeah.
What you need to do then is plug them into words that are commonly accepted, and then hopefully those ideas that those words are supposed to represent are put in a way that then transmits the thought. But the thought is the point. The facts are not the point. The letter B is not as interesting in this sentence as the times that I'm using it to affect.
Mm-hmm.
And again, people need to recognize that you probably don't know as much as you think that you do. And that's actually not a bad thing, because nobody does. Nobody does. And if you come back to that conclusion, I think it comes back to empathy and, a kind of a cumulative human experience that we can try to get by with, a tip of the hat to the common man without wondering like, well, I wonder what he believes though. You know what I mean?
Have you ever heard that empathy is actually not the quality that we want to be practicing, but it's rather sympathy, because we don't want to mire ourselves in the other person's emotions. We want to be able to detach and be able to possibly, objectively, or as much as possible, objectively understand the situation and give an unemotional response and or solution to maybe it's a problem that is being presented. So I find myself very interested in that conundrum, because you hear so many people think about or parrot this idea of having empathy for others and having empathy all the time, and that example has always stuck with me.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a good differentiation there, and maybe in the sentences I just used, sympathy would work better than empathy for the ideas that I'm trying to project. Mm-hmm. Although I would say, as a husband of 21 years now, empathy is the mode that I use with my wife much more than sympathy, because she's not looking for answers when she is telling me all of the trials and tribulations of her life during the day. She's looking for a hug. She's looking for somebody to empathically say, they're there and we're in this together kind of thing. So there's a time and place for both, but certainly nothing is zero sum. And this is something that I learned discreetly over COVID, and certainly throughout the podcast that I did, is there's so many people, all sorts of people from all sorts of different places that play this straw man game of the other side is zero sum. And sometimes there's idiots on the other side that believes that everything is zero sum, but they're not really the ones that should be pushing ideas. But really what it is everything is a la carte. Everything is give and take. Everything is, within moderation. If you start playing in zero sum games about any idea, you're probably a fool or a zealot, and both of which are dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Well, as I think it's Thomas Sowell says from economics, that everything is a trade-off.
Yes.
So, you brought up this idea, Drew, of as I was kind of digesting it, the idea of basically having humility, because once you realize that we don't really know or objectively know all of these things, I think that you arrive at a place that is far more humble, rather than having this arrogant air about you that you know all of these things. And I think to kind of crystallize this, another sentence that you put in your book was that history is a combination of reality and lies. When I think about that, and that's something that I've been considering a lot recently as well, is this idea that history as we read it, and I was very much again exactly the same as you. I hated history and social studies. You couldn't have paid me to care about it when I was forced to learn about it. But through podcasts like Hardcore History, or trying to understand different conflicts in the world, I come to a far more a far better understanding of a lot of these situations through history, or at least so I have a context to understand current conflicts through, let's say. But what role do you think that this, especially the lies portion, plays in our understanding of history?
Oh, it's everything. It basically colors the backdrop of what you think reality is. Like a lot of your subjective understanding of reality, which again, everybody has one. Everybody has a subjective perspective of reality. If we were able, there was a funny social experiment a while ago as an analogy where people would give their phone to one of their friends or family members or a stranger and have them scroll their Facebook or Instagram feed and show just how uninteresting it was to anybody but for the person it was curated for. And what that was a looking glass into somebody else's perspective on reality and what they thought it was. And there's some similarities, but most of it is very proprietary. And that's fine because that's what we have to do, because we're the only ones in charge of finding, looking, learning, accepting the things that we find, learn, and accept. And what that builds is this sort of galaxy of information nodes that is going to look different from everybody other's galaxy out there. And by doing that, it's very important, or at least it changes the flavor, the color, and the shape of what your perspective on reality is, depending on what you allow into that system. Because if you took Dan Carlin word for word, you would know history as far as Dan Carlin said it. But if you go on to somebody else's podcast that also does history, they're going to have a different opinion. And some people call that, the contrary views, what do they call that? Where people are trying to redefine history or try to put a different spin on it, or revisionist. Thank you. These revisionists out there. Now, I don't know that the revisionist or revisionism is necessarily wrong. It's just, it's not homogenous or it's not accepted by the mean, but all things, whether it's science or history or philosophy, changes at the fringes. The accepted norm is never going to be 100% right. And what often you find is it evolves over time to a more nuanceable view because of fringe ideas that then become orthodoxical. And by allowing that to happen, again, you're going to change your own personal experience in reality, depending on what you allow in. So there are people out there that have gone down all sorts of rabbit holes that think that the annihilation of the Jews in World War II was justified. Even today, there's people that still believe that. And these are things that within that logical system of the galaxy of nodes of information that's coming in, seems like a foregone conclusion. And maybe we should do it again. You know what I mean? Like, these are the types of things that Kaylin Ford is very, very concerned about when it comes to the sociology of human at a mass level, for serious reasons, because it changes their perspective in a way that they don't think that what they're seeing is fringe. They think they're seeing what is true. And you can do that with anybody, about anybody, and lead to any conclusion you want. And here's the real kicker. There are people that know that and know how to do the manipulation to lead groups of people into those beliefs. And they're called propagandists. They've been doing this for a very long time, and there's literally books written about this. The most popular one, or most famous one, is by Joseph Goebbels, who was literally the head of the Ministry of Propaganda for Hitler during World War II. They literally, they didn't try to candy coat it like Orwell. They just said Ministry of Propaganda. This is all fake news, basically, and we're just going to make sure that the people believe what we say because we say it long enough and loud enough. And that's something that Hitler was quoted saying too. I don't think he was one that made it up, but he said, you tell somebody or you tell your people something to believe loud enough and long enough, and they'll believe it. And that's because you're coloring the background of what they think actual reality is. And it's something that you, as a sovereign individual, which everybody should aspire to be, need to be very wary and cautious of. And part of being able to do that is by intaking and reading differing perspectives and trying to look for the mean in between, because it's never really in the details. What I find, and this is something that Carl Jung really, I think, cut his teeth on or made accessible to a lot of people out there through the world of psychology, is this idea of the collective unconscious, which is basically a concept that says the things, like I said earlier, the things that last the test of time. The collective unconscious, as far as Jung is concerned, is everything that is the human experience across all cultures, across all time, that you wouldn't need to explain to anybody who doesn't speak your language, that you've never met before. That is basically the cumulative collective unconscious of what it is to be human. And you're going to find things that pass through all different historical and theological and philosophical and scientific outlooks on life as they pertain to the human's perspective of those things. And you'll find things like Peterson likes to talk about the archetypes of the dragon and the joker and the king and the archetypal woman and the archetypal man. And all these things are actually true across all different cultures because it's at that mean level. It's not like, I really don't care about the details of Ki and An as it's opposed, like the ancient religions that believe they were the deities, or of the pharaohs and, whatever gods that they were praying to in the Incan tribes. That's the details that is less interesting to me then what are they trying to say in between, and how does it relate to what I see other people trying to say about the same things? And in that mean, I think, is where you need to start comparing these types of ideas. And if they start sounding a little bit too outside of the mean, it's probably a lie.
Mhm. Yeah, the lens that I try to think about these things through is that, history is always written basically by the winners.
Mhm.
If and I think an interesting example of that is, thinking about the amount of information and books, historical recordings, all of these different things that were captured throughout the years and are held in the Vatican, for example, or another example would be the Smithsonian, let's say in the U.S. There's thousands and thousands of documents and artifacts in both of those places that will never see the light of day, and we can only imagine what let's say the counter books or recordings have to say about any of these different times and or situations throughout history.
Yeah. And what you'll find too, if you start finding confluences of differences between those things, if you ever get access to them, is that it's probably they're being hidden because it served the person hiding its purpose or
Exactly.
their ideology or what they believe the truth is for them, for you by proxy. And that's another dangerous kind of artifact of it's just a very human experience. There are people out there that want to control other people. And once they start figuring out how to by manipulating the reality around them, like look at COVID. COVID's a great example of this because we all lived through it. I don't have to worry that you don't know a certain history lesson from a certain century. We all lived through this thing and watched what could only be defined as mass psychosis, where you had mobs of millions of people that believed the current thing because they were fear-mongered into doing it for loud enough and long enough over the order of years. And they did things and said things and allowed for things that they would never allow for or believe or accept in any other situation. And once that mob dispels, they're probably in a bit of like a malaise, thinking like that was the weirdest thing ever. And you see this actually in smaller aspects with like actual mob dynamics. Like you go out to a rally or you go out to a protest and something sparks off a riot. You're going to find people that work a 9-to-5 job that have like no violent bone in their history, punching people and throwing bricks through windows because suddenly there's a spirit that comes over that crowd. That's a psychosis. That's like this torrent of whatever this emotion or reality or experience is that almost like infects them in that cordyceps way where it overtakes their reasoning systems and they become primal in this weird way. It's something that, again, there are manipulators out there that know how to build the circumstances and realities around to create these things to use as a mallet or a bludgeon against the people or the ideas that they either don't want to have power or to amplify their own.
Yeah, I think a good term to understand that is diffusion of responsibility, right?
Definitely.
If you're part of a crowd and everybody else is doing it, it's kind of like that stupid old saying, if your friend jumped off a bridge, would you? And it's like, well, if you saw 100 people jump off the bridge, you're probably going to do the same because, as a species, we evolved to at least if everybody else is running, we're going to run as well before checking to see, is that actually a tiger in the bushes that's trying to attack me?
Yeah. I mean, there's been all sorts of, I wouldn't say recent, but I guess recent scientific studies that have been done about this. If you want to look at the Milgram experiments or the Stanford prison experiments, there's all sorts of ways to make meager, lowly, regular old Joes do horrific things to people that they don't know and wouldn't wish, pain or suffering upon, all the way up to and including shocks that they think would kill them because they were told to, or they were expected to, or they felt bad if they didn't. And it's like there are ways to manipulate people at a base level, at a rudimentary level that has nothing to do with their frontal lobe and has everything to do with their amygdala, their lizard brain, their flight or fight response. This like right now I need a reaction before I can think about it kind of thing. And you put people into those high anxiety kind of situations, they become incredibly manipulatable. And I'm not saying this as somebody who's immune to it. I'm saying this as somebody who's seen it and experienced it and been in that malaise afterwards, being like, man, I went a little crazy on that, and have to sort of learn from that, hopefully. but it's the operating system that is all built into all of us. We all got the same meat suit that has its own, pros and cons. And for those con men out there that know how to manipulate the cons, they can do some serious damage.
Mm-hmm. Drew, something I wanted to cover with you is this basic idea of, and maybe this for you is informed by your jujitsu experience. For me, there's definitely parts of it that are, or I get respite from it from, training and or doing the races that I do. I think humility is a big part of that. But the general thought to me is that as a society, especially Western society, we're lacking a lot of meaning. Once you cover the, let's say, bottom half of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, to me, I think as humans, we evolved to to always have to solve a problem, to fight against something, to always better ourselves. And when a lot of that struggle has been removed, do you think that creates the symptoms that we now see in society as a lack of meaning, higher suicide rates, higher, this can be quite controversial, but higher rates of transgenderism, where people are just trying to find meaning in their lives, looking to stand out by doing any number of different things.
Yeah. And I mean, you and me talking about this, there's nothing controversial about any of it because people have been talking about the meaning crisis as a basically, a common parlance for years and years and years and years. And I think honestly, like technology is wonderful and bountiful as it allows for us to live our lives is very much to blame for this because of the democratization of information and there's a strange thing that happens. It's almost like an inverse parallel. When you get more and more people able to connect, they tend to isolate even more in a very strange way, that people become their own little echo chamber hermits, in that it's not natural. Like there's, again, in however we were built through whatever purposes or mechanisms led to what we are right now today, there are parameters of what is easiest or most natural for us to live within. And it seems like, I forget the name of this particular rule of thumb, but it's named after some scientist who kind of coined this, but there's a certain number of people that you're basically expected to be able to know in reality, in real life. And it maxes out somewhere between 200 and 300 people that you shouldn't.
I think it was 150.
Is it 150? Okay. So it's certainly nothing in comparison to the average city nowadays. But even just on social media, if you only have 150 followers, you're considered to be a loser. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Whereas like people have 1 million followers and they'll be like, oh, that guy's so popular. I bet you he has one friend, if any. You know what I mean? There's this weird thing that happens because we kind of like insulate ourselves as we get more and more attention, because I don't think we're supposed to have that much attention.
The Dunbar number.
Dunbar, thank you. Yes, that's the one. And I mean, they say that it's because we grew up in tribes and, tribes only got so big before they split, and it tends to be like sort of a 80-20 rule or something like that. But to come back to your question or your idea about meaning, yeah, this is like a major crux to why it's so difficult to find meaning nowadays, because people think that it's through these mediums. Because certainly in the first world, I can't speak to all things at all times, but in the world that we live in, social proof is something we know what that means. And it's a dangerous thing because you think that is something that is a personal worth. And it couldn't be further from the truth. It's synthetic. And if you don't have actual worth backing that up, you're going to find, I got a great example for you. So I came across this story recently on my feed of all places about the guy who invented Minecraft. Okay, so they just had a massive Minecraft movie come out that had Jason Momoa and Jack Black, and it was like breaking records in theater sales, et cetera, et cetera. The guy who created Minecraft has no piece of that because he sold his intellectual property to Microsoft back in 2011, I want to say. Now, the guy who started it, he started it in like the 20-aughts at some point. He had it for like 8 or 9 years, and it blew up at that point. Nothing like what it is now, but to the degree that he had like a real company. He's just a programmer who made this fun little game that you could create building basic blocks. and he just kept playing with it because it was a passion project. And he had it built itself into a corporation that was an international corporation with 45 employees, and it had, lawsuits and lawyers and accountants and all sorts of different things. And he's like, I don't know how to deal with this stuff. I'm just this probably autistic guy who's just having fun on his computer, and it's not fun anymore, and I want out, kind of thing. And he built, I'll get to this in a sec, but it was no longer the thing that drove his passion to do it in the first place. And when it got to that point where it was no longer fun, there was no passion left to do it, and it was a task for him, and he hated it, he sold it off. And what did he sell it off for? I think it was like $11 billion or something to Microsoft. Massive deal. Massive for an individual person. Like, even after taxes, you're set for generations at that point if you aren't completely stupid. In fact, he went completely stupid with it for a little bit because he didn't know what to do with it. This is just some programmer who is, having some fun online. Suddenly he's a billionaire. He bought the most expensive mansion in LA at that point. He outbid Beyonce and Jay-Z, I think, to buy this $70 million mansion overlooking the LA Sky Center. The whole thing. It's got a million rooms, 1,000 pools, the whole thing. And he would host celebrity parties with all these people that are red carpet A-listers that would come over, and he'd try to present himself as this big deal and stuff. And he said that he wanted to kill himself after enough of that, because he had absolutely no meaning. He had everything that everybody out there in the first world thinks they're driving towards: all of the affluence, all of the fame, all of the notoriety, all of the money, all of the cars, all of the mansions, everything. And he had nothing at the end of it. Absolutely nothing, where he just thought the best thing he could do was put a bullet in his brain. Mm-hmm. And that speaks to the crisis that we're talking about, is where is his meaning? His meaning wasn't the mansion. His meaning wasn't the money. His meaning was the game that he sold for those things. And there's a third of that first book, Consciousness, Reality, and Purpose. The third of that book, the last third, is on purpose. And I ended on that on purpose because it is the most important thing. All of the facts and all of the quandaries and all the ideas and the theories out there, be what they may, if you have no purpose, you're going to probably lead an abysmal, depressing existence until you decide to just end it, which at that point actually might make sense, because you don't even understand why you're here, if it matters, that it matters, maybe it doesn't, et cetera, et cetera. And you need to be able to find that anchor point to put yourself down on. And what I found in my own life many, many times over, and it's something that I've used as a guiding star after I've gone through it a few times, is there's a chapter in the purpose section called The Mind of the Ant. And this is an analogy that I propose to people to sort of take themselves out of their own life and put themselves into the mind of a solitary ant. Because it's something that I did just perchance one day. I was sitting down on the sidewalk and watched an ant in front of me going through this gravel driveway. Now, these rocks are probably like mountains to it. And it's this tiny little ant that's going over top of these rocks and in between. And I'm watching it, and I'm just mesmerized by it for 5 minutes. Just thinking about all of the strangeness of this experience that I'm witnessing right now, because what is it actually like to be that ant right now? Because we know, as human beings who've looked into science and watched enough documentaries, that an individual ant is less important than the supermind that is the colony. They're a very peculiar animal because they are like a super intelligence, same as colonies of bees, termites, the same thing. No individual ant understands the incredible work of architecture that is the nest, or how important it is that they dig this amount of dirt for this amount of time for every day until they die. But what is it to be that ant, to put yourself into that experience? And you can only, think about it subjectively, but I'm looking at this thing, I'm like, there's no taskmaster behind it cracking the whip if it doesn't go out there and start doing what it's doing for the entire day that it's doing right now. There's nothing around. There's no other ants. This is a solitary ant. What is driving it to go do these things? And I came to the obvious conclusion that it must be doing what it wants to do the most. No matter what it's doing, it must be what it wants to do the most. Otherwise, there's just not enough reasoning function for it to be doing anything else. It's not doing advanced quadratics. It's not trying to figure out the philosophical quandaries of the universe. It's just it's being guided by, people call it instinct or whatever, but it really is what it wants to do the most. And then I transpose that idea back onto our lives with all the different layers and quandaries and nonsense, honestly, the noise in our lives. And I started thinking, like, what are the things that I want to do the most? And then I sort of retro-dated that back in my life and started thinking, when I did the things that I wanted to do the most, those were the best points of my life. Those are the parts that, whether I made that $1 million or not, didn't matter. That's what I would want to do. Even if I had the $1 million, I would throw it away to be able to do those things. And if you can understand the value of that, then purpose actually finds you in a very easy and natural way, because there are things that everybody naturally wants to do. You're inclined to do. It's that word passion that you brought up. What are you passionate about? That's probably not an accident. That's on purpose, and it is your purpose. And you need to find a way to actuate that, to bring it full circle, to become competent in that thing that you want to do the most. And you're going to have, I mean, it's the oldest aphorism in the book, is find a job that you love to do and you'll never work a day in your life. That really is true. It's not about the work. It's about the thing you want to do.
Mhm. You know, I've seen different examples of this through my life. You know, I worked with particular welders at places through my career, and they'd worked at the same place for 45 years, and they were the most knowledgeable person. You know, just an absolute wealth of information, a walking encyclopedia for everything you could possibly ask them. And they retire and they die.
Yep.
And I heard an idea the other day. It was something like, no matter what you're doing, you have to keep purpose, because without purpose, you have nothing. And
Yep.
I think that kind of comes back to that idea of being able to be quiet and leave room to figure out what it is that you really want to do. You know, obviously that is mostly a luxury in this part of the world, that we have the ability to sit back and ponder what is it that we really want to do. And I completely acknowledge that. But at the same time, you know, I've looked at it before and come to the conclusion that in some ways I have a responsibility to take advantage of the life, or the cards that I have been dealt in this life, and move forward in that direction, because there are people that would kill for the opportunity that I have to be able to do whatever it is that I want to do, and they don't have that luxury or that ability to go and pursue that. And I think keeping that some type of purpose alive in your life, and not only having especially one particular path or one particular purpose, is extremely important.
Yes, 100%. I love to come back to old wisdom for the same reason that we talked about before. If it's lasted this long, it's something that's worthwhile.
Mhm.
And you could sum up the majority of everything that Socrates, who is the essentially the pinnacle of classic philosophy, everything kind of stemmed from Socrates when it came to the Greeks. You can sum up most of everything that he talked about with the entreaty that he got granted by the Oracle of Delphi. He got told, "Know thyself." 3 words literally defined not only him but the generation that came after him, and honestly, like the wisdom of the West started from that nugget of internal introspective truth. Is if you, it's more to the negative, to be honest. If you don't know thyself, you aren't even able to start the race yet. You have to start with that. And so many people go through their life without ever having to or trying to figure that out and answer that for themselves, because it's not something that other people can answer for them. They'll spend thousands of dollars with a psychiatrist to try to figure out who they are. How's that psychiatrist supposed to know that? You know, the best they can give you is homework, which you can do without paying for it. You know, learn and look into yourself and ask hard questions. Do that Socratic questioning thing of asking why about yourself, and it will become obvious. And as soon as you can figure out that answer as who is thyself, you're going to feel a whole lot better and at least have a compass in this world of, well, that's not me and that is. And if you can do that honestly, like honestly, it needs to be an individual thing that you answer for yourself, because if you allow other people to tell you who thyself is, it's probably for their own purposes. So you got to be very, very careful about that. But if you can do it for yourself, it's going to really benefit and hopefully ameliorate some of this meaning crisis, because it will become more and more obvious, like, this is what I should be doing.
Mhm. Drew, this makes me wonder how you look at this through the lens of your 4 kids. You know, do you feel that you have to be deliberate about helping them understand how important having passion is? Do you set any particular rules, let's say against screen time at certain times to be able to um, help create the room for that? How do you look at that through the lens of your four kids, who I'm sure give you an incredible education every day as well?
Oh yeah. It's trying to discover or rediscover the thing you just happen to live through until you're an old balls like me. And you get to witness it in this way that not only you're seeing what it is to actually grow up as a kid, third person, which you've never had the ability to do before you have kids because you just did it and it's over with and you don't think about it anymore. But you also have this really honestly sacred obligation to help guide that path to whatever degree you can. And depending on what school of thought you come from when it comes to child psychology, parents only are able to even direct or redirect kids a certain amount. And honestly, the most they can do is actually damage them. The best they can do is hopefully influence them a little bit. But generally speaking, at least the schools of thought that I've read into, kids will naturally, and this is what I witnessed too, they'll naturally find their own mode the more that they play. You wonder why kids play so much is because they're exploring the world, not just at a visceral level of like, how far can I throw this ball, but do I like to throw this ball? Is this something I want to occupy my time with? And you'll find like my son's gone through different phases of things he's interested in, but I let him get as deep as he wants into all those things. When he was 2 years old, it was everything trucks and trailers and combines and backhoes and stuff like that. And then when he was, 6 years old, it was all dinosaurs and, Paleolithic this and Jurassic that. And now he's all into fish and marine biology, and he's really digging in. But what he's doing is he's flexing and experiencing that muscle of exploration in a way that I want to help edify. And my eldest daughter, who's 13 now, she's coming into her teen years, about to turn 14 next month. She's a avant-garde artist, unbelievable. Like she just eclipses me in every way when it comes to artistic endeavors. She's so good at it, and I want to build a substrate that allows for those roots to grow into. I don't want to guide the roots per se, but I want to make sure that she has a safe playground, a sandbox to experience those things and discover who she is in the time that she'll need to into her 20s and 30s, which is generally when people have to ask those hard questions and make career decisions and stuff like that. But they'll know kind of the direction to go. And I try to seed little nuggets of truth in when she asks questions about like, should I open up commissions on artwork? I'm like, absolutely. But I don't know what to charge. Doesn't matter. Just start moving towards this thing to make it, because it's what you want. You're asking me because it's what you want. You just want to hear it parroted back, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But to make sure I'm not missing the extra layer of point that you put on there when it comes to screen time, it's a very, very, very dangerous thing that you have to take very seriously as a parent. Around our house, screen time is a swear word. The kids hate hearing that term because it means that they're getting cut off after the half hour on YouTube or whatever it is. And you have to as a parent, because we're living in this, nanny society where you can be raised on YouTube or, Disney Plus or whatever it is, and just sit your kids in front of it all day and then just go live your life and think that you're parenting. And hey, sure, as long as you're feeding them and they're growing, that's one thing. But they're going to find that meaning crisis by the end because they've never had to try to experience or learn or build themselves up in the direction that their own internal compass is pointing, because everything is just fast food. It's like feeding your kid cheeseburgers their entire life. Sure, it'll get them through life at a minimum level on that Maslow's hierarchy, but you're not going to be able to go many rungs higher than that because they've never even had direction in how to amplify that. And so for me as a parent, that's what I'm primarily interested in. It's less, there's discipline and bedtimes and meals and stuff like that. That's just like the derivative stuff. But above that, I really love to witness this blossoming into who even is this kid. It's not who I tell them they are, because I don't know who they are. They're going to discover this, and I get to witness it in a very, again, kind of sacred way. It's like, it's kind of hands off, but kind of guiding at the same time in the direction that it's already starting to grow.
Mm-hmm. There's so many parallels here, Drew, to different times in our lives. You kind of mentioned at the top that you're basically you live full time on the road with your wife and your four kids. And my mom was actually a teacher when my sister and I were young. And in I guess it would have been grade 6, my parents got really sick of the rat race, decided to sell everything we had, we had 2 acreages at the time. They had a business. We had our own little side businesses as kids. We sold literally everything we had. We bought a school bus, which ended up being storage, and we bought a 21-foot C-class motorhome. And we went to
Okay.
Mexico and toured around Mexico and the US for 7 months. And we were homeschooled during that time. I know your kids are homeschooled as
Yeah.
well. So do you think that that is a big layer or a big commitment that needs to be taken for most kids to be able to discover that purpose or the muse that really guides their lives?
Well, again, I can't speak to all people for all situations, but I think just at that median level, the more you allow for the natural processes that are supposed to happen in child maturation to just do their thing, that's going to be beneficial. And then, so if you use that as your guiding compass, you can find systems out there that don't allow for that, or that squelch that, or that, cut it off and try to jam that square box into the round hole over and over and tell them that the box is wrong. And I think, I mean, people can rage on about the public school system and it serves its purpose, but I think anybody being honest will recognize that it's a very narrow slot that kids are being funneled down. And if you go back into the history of it, into the Rockefeller age, which I think I did in the first book, certainly in the second one, you're going to find that this is not an accident. There was a point in time where I forget the name of the guy who was like the second-hand man to Rockefeller back in the 1920s, but he had some hella quotes out there that just like raised a hair on the back of your neck, because he was just unabashed about how he wanted to change society for the betterment of the country, that collectivist kind of thinking, where he said, we don't need any more thinkers in our society. We are wrought with lawyers and artists and Renaissance men, and we don't need those embryo great artists anymore. What we need is workers, and we need to build a system that builds workers so that we can build this country with a generation of workers. Now, granted, at the level of country, it worked great, and you built the U.S. empire that was basically built off manufacturing, that really turned into that manufacturing supergiant after and during the Second World War, that gave it its golden era in the 1960s and 70s. But what we're left with is this vestige of a educational system that is meant to simulate the workforce. You're going for 8 hours a day. You have slotted rest periods. You have particular tasks that you have to do. And that's not actually how people learn. Any psychologist out there will tell you that's not how people learn. They will learn through that, but it's not really the natural mode. So you're going to get a de-resolved version of that by the end. And for me, I mean, I went through that system. I had to do most of the heavy lifting afterwards, and it usually came by accident, whether it was, I need to figure something out because I don't know how to do it, whether it's taxes or fixing your motor. These are things that are actually useful in the world that school had nothing to say about, and you have to figure it out. Again, coming back to the idea of competence, it's something you have to build into yourself, and the more you have to retroactively build that out where there wasn't a superstructure that there should have been after your 12 years of education, there's a lot of people out there that are missing a lot of things that, and I mean, for good reason, they feel incompetent because they actually are. And there's nothing worse than like knowing that there's something that needs to be done that you have no way of doing. And maybe you don't know how to do it. You don't know who to talk to do it. And it's a very, emasculating feeling where in the opposite of that, I'm seeing a lot of these schools out there. Apogee is a great one out of Texas. I don't know if you've looked into them, but I got a bunch of friends that send their kids to this Apogee school down in Austin area. Tim Kennedy is part of that, and a bunch of other people of note. And it is like teaching kids the really important basics on top of the classics. So they're going to learn about Mozart and Shakespeare, but they're also going to learn how to change a tire and self-defense. And those are the things that are going to build those embryo great artists into the structure of a more cultured society that we used to have back in, 1600s through the 1800s. And we turned into this like sort of material factory force that education only served to produce. And hopefully we can start to get more of these kids and allow for their wings to stretch and explore things that they want to in a way that they can grow into better versions of themselves. Because I mean, the real tragedy of this is if they don't, you only got on average in the first world 76 years before you're dead. And if you don't figure this stuff out into your late 60s, too late, man. Like you're working on broken machinery and you don't have the opportunities that you could have had in your teens and 20s where you really can get the most out of your time that you got on God's green earth.
Mhm. Drew, what what lessons do you think, or what is the importance of being on the road and being able to show your kids different parts of the world? What part of that do you think is extremely valuable for
Well, you know what's cool is as much as they're out being allowed to experience culture, because they say like you're going to get cultured if you go and travel, you're going to culture yourself. It's a cute term, but it really is what it is. You literally have to wade your way through a variety of different cultures that only really make sense in the environment that they're in geographically. But then you move to another one, and then you experience that one. Then you move to another one, and you experience that one. The first year that we did this was, without getting into the absolute maelstrom of what it was like politically at the time. We started in the mid 2021 for that first year down in the States for about 6 months on a traveler's visa. And we went through 17 different states in 6 months and stopped at, I think, 38 different campgrounds. So there's changes of topography, there's changes of weather, of biome, of language, of culture, of affluence that my kids experienced in a rush, but in a strange way, so did I. I got just as much out of it as they did because it's something I'd never done before. I
you?
traveled a little bit, but kind of just for like one event here and back, whether it's a concert or a tournament or something like that, and I'd be back to life, normality, what reality is. But when you go out and have to actually live in those environments one after the other and have them present the wealth that they have as opposed to the others, you're going to find that mean again in a very interesting way. And one of the easiest ways I can explain this or show, try to display for you, something I had no idea I was going to learn that first year that we did like an L where we started in Alberta, we went down to LA and then over to Florida and then back. And we sort of zigzagged that L in 6 months. And we went through, like I said, 17 different states, all during COVID times, which really showed the difference in what state believed what as we were crossing invisible lines in the sand. It was very interesting to see sociologically. But what I witnessed was a sort of blending at like a gradient blend from west to east and from east to west. And what I noticed was, people think of Arizona, oh, it's a desert. Oh, they think of Louisiana, oh, it's a swamp. But when you start driving from one end of the country to the other across that southern part there, you're going to witness the totality of that landmass in a way that it looks like one thing instead of 50. And it's very interesting because you see it in different lenses. I saw it in the topographic lens where it starts in the LA desert and you start going through these deserts through New Mexico into Texas. And about that midway point, everything starts to green up a little bit. You start getting more meadows. And then you get into Louisiana, it starts getting more swamps. And you get into Alabama and the swamps start to pan out. And then you get to Florida and then you've got the Everglades. And it's this interesting gradients that sort of washes across the whole country in elevation as well as biome. That was really, you have to see it to really then get like a full picture view of what that country is that I'd lived for 40 years before I saw that. And then another thing which I found really interesting was I knew discreetly that the settlers that came over from Europe to the Americas started on the East Coast, Plymouth Rock and all that, and they started spreading towards the West, like go west, young man, start plotting your way out west towards the frontier. But what's interesting is there is echoes of that migration that exist in the architecture. Whereas if you were to start in the east of the country of the US, you're going to see the oldest buildings in the entire country. There's cobblestone on the roads of the French district down in New Orleans or over to Charleston's a great example. It was the oldest city or second oldest city in the US. And you've got like barricades where there's cannons left from the 1800s to fight off pirates, and then as you start going more west from there, everything starts to blend newer and newer builds until you hit LA where everything looks like basically the 1980s forward. But you're seeing like this strange kind of echo of these generations that existed for the last 250 years kind of matriculate across from east to west. That was an education that I got that I couldn't have gotten from a book. It could only be gotten through experience. And, whatever my kids pulled out of that, they got a lot. They got to see all sorts of different things in different places that I don't think they'll even know the worth of until they're older.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I would completely agree. They won't know the worth of it until they're older. And it's very interesting that 2 years ago, I did a very similar trip. I went spend a couple months in Arizona, went to California, did some racing in California, and then went all the way to the East Coast, exactly as you mentioned, all the way through Texas, Alabama, Georgia, kind of ended up in South Carolina. From there, went to Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, all over the place. And in some ways saw, much of the country that I have seen before, but through the lens of actually racing in the backwoods in a lot of these places as well. And this year, I did a lot more exploration of the West Side and especially Mexico. I did 2 trips down in Baja, Mexico on motorcycle. And I'll tell you, traveling and driving a country is an incredible way to see a country and to experience the people, the cultures, what that country really has to offer. But doing it by motorcycle, especially off-road, is a completely new level of education and of very, very immersed and visceral experience of that particular place.
I got a question for you specific to this. So, have you done the Oregon coast on motorcycle?
Yep, several times.
Oh, wow. Okay, so we've only traveled from the south to the north in our Yukon pulling a trailer, but right across the coast where you can see the ocean on the one side of the cliffs. And it's the whole time my wife is like, man, because her brother and her dad love motorcycles and they like going on road trips. She's like, before you die, you have got to come across here. Like between the redwood forests and the crashing waves of the cliffs of the ocean across, it is just jaw-droppingly beautiful. And she's like, I couldn't imagine what this would be like with the wind in your hair and smelling the trees beside you and the ocean breeze. Like this is paradise. So I would love to, have that experience. And I would say for people who haven't, like, man, that is something else.
You know what the funny part about the Oregon coast to me is that every time I've done it, I've always come away with the feeling that this actually kind of sucked.
Oh, well, why is that?
And I expected that exact reaction from you. It is beautiful. It is jaw dropping. It is absolutely incredible. But to do it on motorcycle ends up being A, frustrating, and B, typically very cold. I've done it in July and August. I've been there 3 separate times, at least, done different sections of it, done different distances of it. And every single time we've done it, it was always very cold.
Yeah.
And there's also a lot of tourist traffic on the PCH. So you end up getting really frustrated and people aren't paying attention. They're doing dumb moves on the road. So it actually ends up being a little bit dangerous as well.
Oh, that's too bad. Maybe I got the better experience in the cage then.
Well, I mean, it is absolutely a place that you need to see. I think it is important to experience going through something like that on a motorcycle. There's a spot that we've gone through several times from Great Falls, I believe, Oregon, up and over, and you end up on the Pacific side. So you basically go through from Great Falls, you go west, you go all the way up, you climb, and it's a kind of an old growth cedar, big, huge trees, forest. And then you go through this tunnel, and I swear it's 15 degrees Celsius colder, whatever that would be, like 22 degrees Fahrenheit colder as soon as you come out the other side of the tunnel. And it is this massive contrast. The trees get even bigger. The geography changes. The biome changes. Everything just changes instantly as you come through the other side of the tunnel. But some of my favorite memories from doing a trip like that are exactly those extremes, experiencing the extremes, experiencing, the reality of that place, because, doing it in a vehicle, you can just turn the heat up and you're not affected by it, or close the window, right? On a motorcycle, especially a Rocket that I used to ride, you're out in the elements, period. And, exploring some of the roads from, it was like, we got so sick and tired of being cold that we went from Redding, California up to Eureka, or vice versa, and found this road that was so windy and twisty that there wasn't even a center line on it. By the end of the day, again, I was riding a sport bike. I had worn the paint off the center of my tank from shifting back and forth so many times. My knee pucks were worn out, and my sister and my dad had both actually run their bikes off the road because they came into a corner a little too hot. Thankfully, we didn't have any actual incidents. But that's traveling across the country on motorcycle. That's an experience that you can only have by that many more layers of, let's say, sensory input that you can't get in a car, for example, and especially an airplane.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's really cool to hear. I don't know if I want to do it on bike anymore, but I really enjoyed seeing
I think
the sights,
I think if you have any curiosity towards it, I would do at least one trip to be able to understand what all of those extra layers really put onto you. It's also easy traveling in a vehicle. If you're kind of sleepy or whatever, you can open the window or grab an energy drink. You have a completely different experience again on a motorcycle. And it was only in the last couple of years that I actually bought a set of Bluetooth noise canceling earbuds, and I was able to actually have a podcast or an audiobook on while I'm on my bike. Now I have a big comfy Harley because I'm grateful that I lived through my sport bike experience on the street. And now I have the ability to plug into a podcast, but back when I did the most amount of miles doing those big trips, it was just me and my thoughts and a set of earplugs. And there are a few experiences where you learn as much about yourself in an environment that's constantly changing like that as sitting alone with your thoughts for literally hours upon hours and having nothing to focus on but how uncomfortable your ass or your neck or your traps or whatever it is. And again, that's just another layer to this complexity of moving through that environment.
Well, you need to write your own book about Zen and motorcycles by the sounds of it. It sounds like its own kind of one-person experience.
Well, the wild part about that book is that I've done a lot of a very similar route as what they explain going through in the book. And even 2 years ago, I guess I did a trip across Africa, and unknowingly, it ended up being a very similar trip to the route that they chose on one of the very first Top Gear expeditions that they did. And they also ended the series with the exact same route, going through Africa on the Top Gear travel specials.
Oh, cool.
But I did it off-road on a motorcycle, totally unknowingly. And then I saw this special, whatever, a year and a half after I had gone and done this trip, and seeing some of the same sights and stuff through the lens of these car guys was a completely new and very nostalgic feeling as well.
That's so cool. I used to love watching those specials, especially a Christmas special. Every year we would watch that, me and my brother-in-law and my wife.
Well, and that's something to me that I love the idea of. It's just embarking on some unbelievable adventure where you're going to, let's say you're planning to go from point A to point B, and you're going to add the complexity to the situation by buying a vehicle that is completely unseen and untested. And you just show
usually
up
unreliable too.
Exactly. Show up and make it work. And I mean, this past year I did a 6-day trip on a dual sport, let's say a dirt bike / street legal motorcycle that you can go on either or with. And there was the second trip that I did in Baja this year was literally just all off-road, very difficult terrain. And the guy that organized it is just this basic pioneer in a lot of respects. Goes out, sleeps literally under a tarp, builds these trails, is out away from any hint of civilization for days upon days, just to build these trails, explore these areas. And when you show up, you get a set of GPS tracks, and the guy says, "We'll see you at the end of the day. And if we don't see you, that's your problem." And again, this something I've talked about on the podcast before, this idea of taking personal responsibility, understanding what you really need to survive through a situation like that, a day like that, what elements you're possibly going to encounter, being prepared for all of that, and being competent enough to solve any number of problems that might come up. That's what my passion and my life is all about.
Yeah. That's phenomenal, man. I don't know, it stokes my fire hearing stuff like that because I don't know, I don't even have to experience the same experience to be like, hell yeah, hell yeah. Because what I'm feeling is like that there's there's something that comes with competence or from competence that is you have a self-confidence from it that you may not and usually don't know what the hell to do in an emergent situation, but you don't lose your head because you've been in enough of them that you're like, all right, let's just figure it out kind of thing. And it's one thing that's it's like everything about wisdom is it comes from experience and you start to aggregate these things and you become, I mean, some people call it an autodidact. It's just, you know, a little bit about a lot of things, but it's not a lot about a little thing. And it really, I think, builds out this web that allows you to feel secure in situations that most people would panic. And I don't know, it's very inspiring to hear that from people that do that the more often that they do.
Hmm. Well, and I mean, there's so many of these examples, and this is exactly why I started this particular podcast, because I want to be able to share some of these experiences, whether it is, you know, Sean Newman asking me, hey, would you do a keynote speech? Oh man. And my initial reaction is, yeah, I probably don't want to do that. And then I think about it, I'm like, no, that sounds hard. I should do that. Right.
Yeah.
Or putting myself in a completely novel situation in Mexico on a motorcycle. You know, those two things don't typically, let's say, square, but being able to build that set of experiences to be comfortable in any of those situations, or at least to be able to have a skill set that applies to many of those different situations, is something that, again, that I'm super passionate about.
Yeah, and maybe that's something that people out there that are hearing this stuff and want to do for themselves will allow for the latitude of them to find that meaning or to come into confrontation with meaning because they're finding purpose and the ability to actuate their purpose. The more functional they can become in the real world.
Yeah. So, Drew, one thing that I find in a lot of ways that I would like to cultivate more in myself is creativity, just basic creativity. When you and I started talking about the idea of your newest book here, Fractures, the process of how you're going to go about writing this, and especially the most important part is that it is a 4-book series. That to me was super interesting. And of course, we've talked a lot about your other 2 books, which were very nonfiction, very let's say, trying to be very tangible and dealing with experience of everyday people. How do you feel like writing this new book through the lens of a fictional series or trilogy, however you want to put that? How do you feel like that is an easier way to actually get some of these same points across?
Well, for one, it's going to be much more accessible for people out there. One thing that I wrote about when I was coming, I think it was in the purpose, no, the reality portion of that first book is the idea that coming back to words and getting experience out there, there's a balancing point between trying to get an acute thought out there and doing it in a way that people can actually ingest it. So I can be very discreet, and I like to be, and maybe it's like a pro or con depending who you are, how your brain works. I can be very precise about what I'm trying to say on a particular thought, but then it's going to turn a lot of people off that just don't have the appetite for that. And one thing that everybody has an appetite for because they never had to learn it, they never had to have it taught, is story. So people they translate reality around them by story. And there's another thing that Carl Jung talked about when it came to archetypes is take, for example, you're driving down a highway and you're seeing trees speeding past you beside. They, to you, are chunked as tree, if they're chunked at all. because it's relative to what's important for the task at the time.
Mhm.
But there's a whole story to that you could spend your entire life on a single tree and discover the value and the importance of that thing. But for the time being, it's just tree. And you can, and that's kind of what I did with these first two books is I really looked at the tree and I tried to break it down to its like base components and make the intricacy between its systems apparent and stuff like that. But people are more used to that experience of flying down the highway and how it pertains to them in their everyday life. So if you can find a way to transpose the the value of the discrete information, the data, or the wisdom that you've come across into a way that's accessible through story, you're going to reach 99% more people than you would with the 1% that are there for the data.
Mhm.
And so what I tried to do through this, and I came across it actually through my own reading of other people's works, like great authors and great philosophers and great theologians, people like C.S. Lewis, people like Nietzsche, people like J.R.R. Tolkien, people like Orwell, people like fill in the blank of all these great notable authors over the last 200 or so years. And what I notice is, yes, they have their treatises. Yes, they have their philosophical diatribes, and you can go down the rabbit holes as far as you want to go with their thoughts, and they're very well thought out. But nobody knows them for those works. The people that know them at all know them for The Hobbit. They know them for Narnia. They know them, fill in the blank. They've got their works of fiction that are just the capstone on their giving back to society and to humanity. And that's because I came to this conclusion myself. It's because people love story. They resonate at that collective unconscious level of like, who is the bad guy? What is the scenario that has to be overcome by the unlikely hero? Like these are things that everybody understands. And if I can build that out in a way that actually displays the thoughts that I put into my first two books, I can do both things at the same time, and it becomes not only more enjoyable, but more accessible. So that's basically the effort that I'm trying to do through a fictional environment where I could argue with you or someone else about the ideas that I have ideologically, like point for point, or I could have my character do that to another character, and you can watch third person where you don't have an ego in the mix and you're worried about losing. You can actually take that thought in third person in a way that you'd be like, wow, I didn't see that coming. That's kind of cool. And you wouldn't have thought that if I would just lay it out like it was on a chalkboard for you. And so I hope that people can walk away with an experience that translates into thoughts that start ruminating in their head, because there are some serious moral quandaries that come up in what is a fictional dystopian that is being built out through this first 35 chapters of what will be a 140 chapter total epic series through 4 books. And like this first one, it's a chonker. It's about 650 pages and about 150,000 words, but it's going to walk you through the eyes of a slave race fighting their way out of totalitarian indentureship to try to win their freedom back, and finding all the choices that they make along the way might turn out to be a little more dire than they thought when they began. And it's going to present to you in a way that should be accessible. Something that is my favorite part of philosophy. They're called trolley problems.
Mhm.
And a trolley problem, for people who don't know that term, is a classic example of you stand at the throw switch of a trolley that will either send a speeding trolley that's coming towards you left or right. And on the left side of the track, if you don't throw the switch, 5 people are tied up and will surely die if you don't throw the switch. Whereas on the right side, there's 1 person tied up who will surely die if you do throw the switch. What do you do? And so the obvious answer is, well, I'm going to save the 5 people instead of the 1. I'm sorry, for the sake of the many, we're going to kill the few. And then it turns out that that guy would have cured cancer. And you find out these things later on, that these trolley problems that seem obvious start stacking upon each other. And what started out to be an obvious struggle for autonomy turns out to be an absolute dystopian tragedy. And you might actually not even recognize it's happening till the end. And then looking backwards, you're like, oh my God, what did we do this whole time? And that's a story that is as old as time, because it's been replayed over and over and over in the rise and fall of empires. That is harder, I think, to grasp if it weren't in the capsule of story.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting example that I heard about the book, about a very humorous situation that you wrote into it about, I think it was somebody dying or something like that, and
Mhm.
you're almost rooting for that and laughing at that at the time, and then very deliberately again in the second book, you learn, let's say, the other side of it and feel completely mortified that you kind of laughed at the situation from the first book, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So like I said, it's 35 chapters in each book. In the 35th chapter in this first book, there's a portion that I meant to write as comedy. Like I literally knew it was going to be funny. I kind of laughed as I was writing it because it's just so absurd. But it involves murder.
Mhm.
And if that's somebody who's the bad guy, you don't only not feel bad about that, you feel justified about that. And you're okay with that guy dying horrifically because he deserved that. Well, what we're doing in the first book is showing a timeline from one race's point of view, which is the Theutons. And the Theutons are the slaves to the Rayans. And what we're going to do in the second book is run through the exact same timeline from the Rayans' perspective. And you're going to flip headlong on who's the good guy and who's the bad guy when you start to put names and faces and life experiences behind the people on both sides of the story, where at the end of the day, you may think there is no good guy. There is no bad guy. They're just people that are stuck in a horrific scenario that they're trying to navigate. And it's heartbreaking to watch third person, but hopefully through that trauma, through that heartbreak, like I'm serious. Like this book can really dig at you. My wife just finished it. She wanted to wait until it was fully done. It took like almost a year to write and get edited. She's like, I'll wait till I get the final product, then I'll read it through, because she's an avid reader and she loves fantasy and fiction. And there's a couple chapters she hated me for. She's like, "You're a jerk. We're friends off. That was awful." And I'll be like, "Yeah, well, just wait for the second one. It's going to happen from the opposite direction." And like the things that you were like, kind of F those guys for what they did. You're going to understand why they did that. And maybe you'll feel justified the second time around and feel less bad about it. Or you'll feel sorry for the person who did the atrocious thing, or you'll feel sorry for the person who had the atrocious thing done to them that you laughed about. And if I can do that, I think that that is the greatest service I can present to the audience, for the same reason that I sort of came to the conclusion of after that second book of humility and empathy and sympathy. Is like, you are what you are from the position and the subjective perspective that you think you are in, and trying to do the best if you're trying to do the best. Some people can't even try because they're so mired in the milieu of, but trying to find the bad guy sometimes is harder than it seems when you start getting more and more perspectives built on top of each other. And then, I mean, that's just the first two books in a 4-book series. So where we're going to carry it on from there is going to expand this universe one ring at a time, to the point that finally, when you complete the 140th chapter, you'll understand what the first book was about the entire time. And that's my goal, is to make it an all-encompassing, standalone piece that makes you want to start back at the beginning and really understand the story, because you won't really until the end, and then you really won't until the second read through.
Yeah, that's something that I find is just a fascinating idea. I believe, as you put it, the series is going to be something like a Celtic knot, where you end
Mhm.
up in the same place where you began, with a completely new understanding, and you almost need to reread it to actually be able to apply that full understanding through that new lens that you've acquired after the end of the series.
Yeah. Yeah. There'll be little things. I've sprinkled all sorts of different Easter eggs into the first book that have absolutely no relevance to the first book, that later on, maybe you'll pick it up in the third book or the fourth book, but in the second read through, you'll be like, holy shit, that sparrow, that one sparrow. And it'll change your whole perspective of what was going on during like a fairly regular run of the mill scene.
Mhm.
Or like that one cabin in the woods, like, oh my God, I understand what that means now. And all I thought it was just sort of like a place that people went sometimes. It's going to be like that on purpose. I'm trying to build it in that Celtic knot sense, where I need it all to conclude in the same place it stopped, so that you can, instead of following the line the whole time, step back and witness that sort of beautiful tapestry that got built throughout the whole thing, that self-perpetuates and self-justifies all the way around. And you can sort of pick and choose what you want to take out of that, but it will be a sort of a roller coaster that ends where it starts, and hopefully is an experience that people can get value out of.
Mhm. Well, Drew, I really love that idea of teaching through story. Any of the best books, the most memorable books that I've physical books that I've read, and been able to digest and not put down, are all basically nonfiction told through a story. And I think that that's a really interesting way and important way to be able to tell a story, because, you know, anybody can write their thoughts down and kind of get through. I don't want to say anybody get through publishing a book, but to be able to tell a story in a compelling way while you're actually learning valuable thoughts, ideas, facts, I think is an absolutely invaluable concept.
Yeah, well, that's my hope. I feel like I'm in the sort of granite chipping phase of what I'm hoping to be a magnum opus. I really want to pour myself into this, and I honestly have no aspiration for fiction outside of this series. I want this to be sort of the one that people remember if they know my name later. That he was the guy who wrote Fractures, the same way that you remember Tolkien's the one who wrote The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, or C.S. Lewis was the one that wrote Narnia. I really want it to be that sort of crowning achievement. And maybe it sounds egotistical, but I feel like it wasn't worth starting this effort because it's a very tiring and thankless effort to try to do if it wasn't in service of that final completed, Michelangelo piece that started from that block of granite. And it takes a lot of chips and a lot of work. But if you didn't have that vision, that structure again from the beginning of what this thing is going to look like one of my favorite quotes, and I think it was from Michelangelo back in the Renaissance. Somebody asked him, because it's just this absolutely phenomenal sculptor that, like, if you've seen any of his work, it's you can feel the viscera of the muscles ripple on the horse's rump. You know what I mean? Like the detail is unbelievable, and it's a solid single piece stone that he carves these things out of. And he was commissioned to carve this effigy of a horse. And while he's sort of chipping away at this raw granite block, a guy, I think it was either the guy that was commissioning it or somebody who was there studying him, said, "How do you know how to shape this thing? Because what I'm seeing is just this gigantic marble block, and you're going to make it into this intricate thing. Like, how do you know where to stop? How do you know where to start? How do you know where to go?" He's like, "Well, it's simple. I just chip away everything that's not horse."
Mm-hmm.
He
I
knew
believe
what was
it was
in
actually Michelangelo that he was doing.
Was it Michelangelo? Well, who did I say?
Chip away, or sorry, David, because that's the
okay,
the statue that he made, right? I chip away everything that's not David.
Yeah, I heard that as chipping the. I'm sure the idiosyncrasies being what they are. Yeah, it is. But the point again being, like, he had that vision beforehand, and that's in that spirit. That's what I'm trying to produce here. Is I know by the end of this book, by the way, you probably might wonder, how do you even have a sequel to this, let alone 3? Because it ends in a way that is probably going to drop most people's jaws. And I say that unabashedly because it's meant to be that way. It's holy crap. That's what this ended up as. Like, what do you do from there, kind of thing. But it's for that. It is all in service of this greater picture, that if it didn't have all of these steps along the way, it wouldn't validate the ones that are going to circle back into it later. I mean, I can go on for ages about this because it's been like the majority of my thought for the past year, day to day, minute to minute, hour to hour. I'm in this universe trying to track like all of these working cogs and moving pieces, and like coming to my own aha muse moments of like, oh, I understand why that person did that back then, because it has to lead to this now that I couldn't have seen if I was laying it out in a structured sense. So it's quite an experience from the first person view, but you can, experience it from the third person if you want to go check out the books right now. I'm actually recording the audiobook for it right now too, which is going to be its own magnum opus experience, because it's going to end up being 14 and a half hours of audio. That's going to take over 100 hours of recording and editing and production. And I'm adding musical scores that are proprietary in the background, sound effects. I've got a written song that's going to finish off the end of the last chapter that my daughter is singing the lyrics for. It's a big major production. So once that comes out, hopefully in the next month or two, it'd be another way to experience it. Maybe throw those earbuds in and see what you think.
Excellent. Well, Drew, I look forward to checking it out. One thing that I want to be a little bit more deliberate about going forward, especially when this podcast is considered, is trying to learn something from each guest. So what would you, let's say, like to leave people with as a skill that you think is of either utmost importance or something that is very important to you or easily translatable to you? Is that something like sharpening the blade of discernment? What would something like that you would like to leave listeners with?
Okay. I've got a good one. I've sat on a lot of different podcasts because it is really that valuable. And it's something that I came across, believe it or not, when I was 12 years old. And it has stuck with me ever since. And I remember this like literally remember this every time a major decision or a major crux or a fork in the road comes up in life. There was a time when I was 12 years old that I went to the Olympic swimming pool in my town. I was growing up in Kamloops, BC, and they had this pool that was meant for the Canada Games, and they built it out with all these diving boards. So you got your 1 meter, and then you go to your 3 meter, and those are your springy boards that people are used to seeing people bounce off of and doing flips. But then they had a 5 meter, which was a cement obelisk that was just like a fat cement slab that there was no spring, and you just walked off like it was a lemming suicide run. And for a 12-year-old, a runty 12-year-old, I'll say too, I didn't hit my growth spurt till I was graduated. I was always a short kid. I went with my friend who is much more outgoing than me. And basically he was brave enough to jump off the 5 meter, but I didn't want to touch it because I'm sure I would die. And he, of course, good friends being what they are, bullied me into, you got to do it before we leave, or else, you're a pussy. You have to do it. So I kind of like, built up my courage, built up my resolve, and stood in line to wait to go up to this 5 meter. And when it was my time, I walked up there and I walked to the edge and looked down at the infinity that was below me. And I could hear the eagle shrieks of, 70,000 feet down. Sure that I'm going to die. But then I walked back to the edge, or to the beginning of the platform, and looked back at the lineup that was waiting for me to go. I'm like, all right, I got two choices, and one of them I'm absolutely not doing. And what I'm absolutely not doing is walking back down these stairs. I will die from embarrassment if I do that. So here's what I'm going to do, Drew. We're going to walk to the edge and step 1 foot off. And then after that, I'm going to step the 2nd foot off, and I can make all my regrets on the way down. And that's exactly what I did. It was the most ungrateful dive, if you can call it that I've ever done in my life. I literally walked off like a robot and plummeted to the most fun I've had up to that time in my life. And I ended up jumping off it until they closed the place down that evening. And what I took away from that is, if I come up on something that is scary, but it has potential, like for example, selling your house and putting your family of 6 into a travel trailer, which you've never had before, and driving your truck around North America, which you've never done before, that's a pretty platform moment. And instead of thinking about all the ways it can go wrong, because you'll paralyze yourself with all the ways it can go wrong, I'll say, I'm going to step both feet off and make my regrets on the way down. Mm-hmm. And that has serviced me over and over and over in life, and led me into places that I would never have gone by choice, and I would never take back after that, the fact. So if I were to encourage anybody out there who is in those situations or finds himself in those situations, my unsolicited advice is jump both feet in and make your regrets on the way down. And chances are, probably 99 times out of 100, it's going to be a lot better off than you thought you were going to be.
I think that really is a really important lesson. And a lot of that also harkens back to this idea of how to build competence by, really exposing yourself to these different things, whether it is jumping off both feet first, or like you said, selling your house and going traveling. Excellent, Drew. Well, I really appreciate the time, man. It was an excellent conversation that I really enjoyed. Let people know where they can find your books, your podcast, and anywhere else you want to interact.
All right. Well, as far as social media is concerned, I'm almost primarily on Instagram. You can find me at drew.weatherhead. That's my personal account. It's mostly jujitsu. I've got an author account, which is drew.w.author. And I've got one thing we didn't even touch is I run the largest Brazilian jiu-jitsu meme account in the world off Instagram called Because Jitsu. It's because_jitsu. And you can go for the lols there if you want. But otherwise, check out the book. I've got those 3 books. If you want to check out the fantasy one, it's the newest one called Fractures in Love. The other 2 are Consciousness, Reality, and Purpose, and Layers in Truth. And all of those are accessible through Amazon. Just look up my name, Drew Weatherhead, and they should all pop up. And I appreciate everybody who's got interest in checking them out, and hit me up afterwards. I'm always available in DMs. Let me know what you think. And I appreciate all the people that both support and are intrigued in the things that I do.
Absolutely. I hope we send some new readers your way, Drew. Thanks again for your time. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, back at you. Thanks a lot, Tom.